to be recorded, and that will be available later. We're hoping to get that posted on the website, same one, anthc.org/MMIP. So this session has 3 sections to it. We'll have 2 different presentations and then the open discussion where you can share your questions, comments, or related announcements. So without further ado, let's get started with our first presentation, and join me in welcoming the Alaska Department of Law Special Assistant Attorney General Charlotte Rand and Assistant Attorney General Chris Darnall.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathleen, and thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited to be presenting to you guys and kind of hoping to start a partnership that will make some really important changes and going forward. So I'm here today with, I work for the Attorney General's office. I'm a special assistant to the Attorney General. My primary focus is on trafficking crimes and sort of how to better prepare the state to respond to both the law enforcement sector and the victim services providers, and kind of bridging that gap in our response to trafficking and sexual assault. I'm here today with Chris Darnall. Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Assistant Attorney General Chris Darnall. I'm an Assistant Attorney General who works at the Special Office of Special Prosecutions within the Department of Law. Under that umbrella, I actually focus on cybercrime as the primary specialty that I deal with. Of course, as y'all are probably all aware, human and sex trafficking oftentimes has a cyber nexus. So under the guise of cybercrime, I am often tasked with handling cases involving human and sex trafficking, in addition to sexual abuse as well as sexual assault. I'm really happy to be here talking with Charlotte today and presenting on this topic that's of concern to everybody here, I'm sure.
Great, thanks, Chris. And so, Chris, you can go to the next slide. This is our contact information. We will also put it in the chat and make it available to everybody at the end, or maybe Chris, you want to do that now. Please, just I want to reiterate, always feel free to reach out to either of us with any questions, concerns. We're an open book, and we are looking for you know, all the sort of working together that we can get. So Chris, you can go to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about human trafficking, and Chris is going to start off by kind of taking us on a venture through the law of human trafficking. So what does it look like under the law, federal, state law? What are the elements of it legally? And then I'm going to talk more about how it might look to you or I, or somebody who's not working with it legally, kind of on the ground. And we've included some information about, I'm not sure how many people today are sort of experienced with the medical world or operate in some part of that world, but hopefully we'll kind of provide some information that might be helpful as far as interventions in a healthcare setting. So I will, I'll let Chris take it away.
All righty, folks, I'm going to go ahead, as Charlotte mentioned, and talk about what human trafficking is under the law, because as you might be aware, when folks are talking about human trafficking, they're likely talking about a number of different things and criminal offenses. So what do we mean? Getting a definition that we can all kind of agree on is pretty important within this space, because a number of individual organizations have their own working definitions with different focuses and priorities. For instance, the Department of Homeland Security has a definition that I've just placed up on the screen that largely tracks the definition found in the federal code. And that's because they're a federal agency and they're primarily focused on dealing with federal violations of federal law. Can flip to the United Nations Department Office on Drugs and Crime. They have their definition is more focused on people and the exploitation of people. The DOJ, like the Department of Homeland Security, also has a working definition that largely tracks the United States Code. Similarly, here in Alaska, we use a definition grounded in state statute. So there's a lot of different definitions out there, varying places and varying authorities supporting those definitions, but there is some commonality within everything. The definitions for human trafficking also tend to encompass what people think of colloquially as sex trafficking. With that in mind, there's typically a commercial sex element or a sexual conduct nexus to any definition that we're going to be working with. When these definitions don't focus on sex, they're going to be focusing on labor, whether that's labor itself or through the acquisition of people to perform that labor. In both sex and human trafficking, as defined, tends to be accomplished in the same way. And that's going to be accomplished through a force, fraud, deception, or coercion. All varying types of exploitation that's aimed at taking advantage of a vulnerable victim in a vulnerable position. So what human trafficking laws do we have in Alaska, and what do we use to prosecute offenders in this state? I just want to talk briefly. In Alaska, we have two real statutes that we're going to be using for human trafficking. That's 1141-360 and 1141-365. Human trafficking in the first degree is codified by 1141-360. As we just spoke about, the definition largely tracks, the focus is on compelling or inducing somebody to act. In this case, that's causing them to act and engage in certain activities, sexual conduct, adult entertainment, or labor, using a force, fraud, or coercion against that person. So in essence, it's making somebody do the things that you would typically think of as human or sex trafficking, using threat against anyone, force against anyone, or deception. Second degree human trafficking is more aimed at somebody who's obtaining the benefit from an individual who's being trafficked. So that's companies who employ trafficked labor. That's individuals who are profiting from individuals working with their home as a product of trafficking. So what it criminalizes is recklessly disregarding the fact that you're benefiting from the proceeds of a trafficked victim. So as I just mentioned a second ago, sex trafficking or human trafficking comes in two flavors under the criminal law, at least in Alaska. On one hand, you have human trafficking. On the other, you have sex trafficking. Sex trafficking in Alaska is criminalized under 1166, 110 through 140. So in the first degree, it can get it in three ways. You can make somebody prostitute themselves through the use of force. You can induce a child under the age of 20 to prostitute themselves, or you can induce somebody who's in your legal custody to engage in prostitution. Second degree similarly is accomplished in one of three ways. An individual is guilty if they're supervising a prostitution enterprise, if they go out and solicit a patron for a prostitute, or if they're involved in facilitating or accommodating commercial sex tourism. So we live in the modern day. Those are the statutes, and that's all well and good. But where are folks being trafficked, and what does it look like today in the 21st century? Some of you might be familiar with the term the track. In sex trafficking parlance, that means where individuals were historically walking up and down the road plying their wares as a result of being trafficked. The question I have for you is, do you think that this is still the track? Is this where prostitutes are being forced to walk up and down? And the answer to that question is yes, to some degree. There are indeed still individuals who are out and about every night being forced to walk up and down these cold streets and perform acts. But the reality is, in the 21st century, folks have moved on to the internet, which is why trafficking falls under the umbrella of cybercrime. It's anonymous, everyone has access, and it's everywhere. Individuals who have been working in crimes against children have been aware for years, and they've known that Main Street's pavement cobbles have now become copper streets paved by bits and bytes. They also know that the internet has gone, that people have gone from trafficking via word of mouth or discussing these things in the cold shadows to blatantly advertising the prostitution of even children online in the open marketplace that we all have access to. And all of this is because we're living in an increasingly interconnected world. Recent studies showed that 97% of Americans own a cell phone of some kind. Of those 97%, at least 88% of them admitted to taking those cell phones into the bathroom. Those devices are with individuals almost every hour of every day. That's why even the Supreme Court has said that, whoa, cell phones are different, take a step back. And the fact that these devices mean that we're always a second away from being connected to others comes with a very strong danger at this. It's both awesome and literal. It's both awesome and amazing in the literal sense to be a second away from connecting to anybody, but it's also scary because the fact of the matter is that anyone else is a second away from connecting to you. And there are a lot of people out there who don't think like you or I do, who are looking to find a victim and who really enjoy the anonymity they gain from being online. And the sad fact is, trafficking no longer occurs in the shadows. In recent history, if somebody wanted to sell sex outside of a place like Las Vegas, that wasn't a conversation that was happening out in the daylight on the street corner. And if somebody was looking to profit off the sexual abuse and exploitation of a child, that conversation wasn't even happening on a Vegas street corner at night. But now trafficking of minor victims even occurs in the modern equivalent of an open marketplace. I ask any of you on the call, do you recognize this site? You should. It's local. I opened up this site and took a screen cap yesterday. I suspect a large number of you on this call have checked job postings, maybe pursued a furniture selection or more. All of that because this website is one of the most popular websites in the nation. And you know, it's Craigslist. It's hugely popular. At one point in Craigslist history, they had over 50 billion unique page views per month. That made them 27th in the nation for popularity. Now, brief history about Craigslist. Originally, the site had a section called erotic services that was aimed at selling erotic services. Public outcry and law enforcement interest eventually led to Craigslist rebranding its erotic services section as an adult services section. Eventually, even that became too much, and Craigslist removed the romance section, its personal section, and its adult services section in 2018, largely in response to legislation aimed at addressing trafficking. Now, all of that sounds great, but the sad fact is traffickers are always going to find a way. This is a screen cap from Craigslist in Anchorage yesterday. Just clicked over to the missed connections section. Looking at these titles, some of them are very likely legitimate, and I am in no way saying that these are evidence of trafficking or trafficking posts. But the problem is they illustrate the problem. How can you tell when somebody who's looking for a date is looking for a date? How can you tell when somebody who's looking for a girlfriend is looking for a girlfriend? These could be individuals advertising in plain view, and there's very little we can do except respond to every ad, which is largely impractical when you have a limited number of officers investigating a nearly unlimited number of cases. So Craigslist eventually shut its section down, and lo and behold, someone was waiting in the wings for their moment. And I hope none of you recognize this page outside of perhaps working with victims, but the second fiddle waiting in the wings was Backpage.com. And Backpage has always been the other major player in the sex trafficking game. And they were more direct than Craigslist, and they catered specifically towards individuals looking for escorts and escort services, prostitution. In essence, there was an entire site that worked like Craigslist's adult services section. And when Craigslist was shut down, Backpage saw a huge increase in the average number of monthly visitors. And that's because shutting down a site doesn't necessarily do much to address the demand, or in reality, the supply, given the ease with which one can set up a website hosted on a server that we can't get to without process between oftentimes hostile foreign nations. And make no mistake, these sites, Backpage was hugely profitable. At one point, they were reported to be making $22 million a year simply for acting as a sex hosting service. And they were particularly brazen. Not only did they fail to hide what they were doing, they largely defended themselves, in some cases in court with some success, as defenders of the First Amendment, rights to association. And they even went so far as to pat themselves on the back for, at times, cooperating with law enforcement to take some measures to find underage prostitutes. But the reality is, whatever Backpage was doing, they certainly weren't doing enough. Because in 2018, the US Attorney's Office filed suit against 7 individuals for charges ranging from prostitution to money laundering and seized the Backpage domain. A criminal suit was filed because at some point prosecutors found that there was enough evidence going on to show that the owners of Backpage were complicit in the activity and the exploitation that was going on. So that all sounds great. Backpage was gone in 2018. And of course, as we all know, trafficking stopped at that moment. Well, not really. The result was a fractured market. Just as when Craigslist was shut down and its erotic services section individuals moved on to Backpage, individuals who have been displaced by Backpage's shutdown have moved on to other sites. And it makes sense why this happens. Trafficking overall is a low-cost, high-profit enterprise, particularly when it's done online. And the reality is, traffickers know that it's particularly difficult to build these cases. So taking down one site didn't necessarily stop the traffickers from engaging in their activities. But the reality is, we had Backpage, and now we have other sites. For example, you have Skip the Games. It looks a lot like Backpage. You've got international cities. You've got clearly advertising escort services. You have very brazen advertising out in the open. And again, that is one of the issues. The way they advertise is very, very intentional. Escort services without a prostitution hook could very well be legal. And there very well could be legal activity going on this website, interspersed with the illegal. It simply makes things much harder to sift through. Of course, there are clues to look for if someone wants to find a trafficking victim. We're not going into that now at this point, but if anyone has any questions, I can absolutely tell you some of the things we're looking for, because the reality is traffickers want their clientele to know what's what. But again, it's happening out in the open and there's no way to know for sure. And it's not just Skip the Games, because the reality is if it was Skip the Games and that's it, we would have one target, we'd have one place to go, and we'd know where to look. But as you probably realize, it's really not that simple. While Skip the Games has floated to the top, a quick Google search yesterday brought up 10 alternatives just by going and searching to finding the top result. And each of these websites, each of them listed here, is simply a back page waiting in the wings if we take down Skip the Games. Compounding the problems with displacement is the fact that the means of sale are constantly changing. For example, in the past 5 years, there's been a burgeoning market for amateur pornography using sites like OnlyFans and webcam sites. Again, while individuals might be performing legal activities for money, the reality is these are also prime real estate for traffickers to ply their trade. And of course, escorts are not limited to the obvious places to ply their goods. They're also using legitimate dating websites to arrange dates. While less common, you can absolutely find prostitutes lined up on websites that are primarily aimed at dating. As I said when I started, the sad fact is that perpetrators have been more than happy to move from the streets to copper, bits, and bytes. And as a real-world example, for just as recently as October 2017, a trafficker was convicted for trafficking, child pornography, and obstruction of justice. The man used psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse to trick others to willingly come work for him in Seattle as prostitutes. He would send them fake photos that appeared to make him look like a Hollywood agent, falsified bank statements, and then he would coerce them into signing official-looking documents that purported to be binding promises that would bound them to give him $1,000 a week of prostitution proceeds, all for the chance to win $20 million. These are people who have been manipulated by devious, cunning defendants. At least one of this individual's victims reported that she was lured into his services through a dating website. She ended up being forced into prostitution because she was looking for a date and help with her career. So aside from dating sites, where are these defendants finding recruits now that the track has moved online? And I think you all know the answer. It's social media. I may be dating myself here, but I think it all started with MySpace, and I had a MySpace. After that, you had Facebook, and then there was Instagram, and then it just kept going. At this point, there's a social media option for every person, no matter what your particular flavor of social media is. And that should mean it comes as no surprise that a huge percent of the population has adapted to and accommodated social media in a short period of time. According to a study conducted by the Pew Research Center, Around 5% of adults admitted to using social media in 2005. By 2010, that number was close to 50%. And by 2021, that number had skyrocketed to 72%. That is a drastic increase over the span of 15 years. And I'm sure we've all seen how social media has come to affect our day-to-day lives in the real world. And remember, traffickers are people too. They live in the real world with the rest of us, and they are more than aware that all of our children are online. And that's why they're online too, posting pictures of drugs, of money, their lifestyle, glorification of pimping, and simply images depicting gang life and their life in general. All of this is being used to entice children and young folks onto social media and into the life. It's all a lie, but who is the least well positioned to figure that out? Children and young folks who lack the context or the experience to suss out truth from fiction. And law enforcement is very aware that traffickers of all kinds are using online platforms to recruit their victims. As recently as March 2020, the FBI posted an alert specifically aimed at informing the public of the dangers associated with being online on some popular platforms and the risks of being recruited into trafficking. They identified several real-world chilling examples. For instance, in Baltimore in 2019, a trafficker simply saw two young ladies posting on social media about financial difficulties. That was his in. He used that information, swept in, and eventually used their financial stress to coerce and convince them into engaging in prostitution. And that's not to say this just happens with sex work. This absolutely happens with human and labor trafficking as well. In 2019, a married couple was convicted. Both of them were convicted when they were found using fake advertisements in an Indian newspaper to lure foreign domestic workers into the country with promises of wages that never materialized. They were told they were going to make money and work a reasonable hour. They made no money and worked 18 hours a day. It happens everywhere. It happens online. And you've heard me talk a whole lot about national issues, and I absolutely understand you might be thinking, well, Baltimore isn't Alaska, and at the end of the day, we might be a little different up here. But the sad fact, trafficking is a national problem with a local impact. Individuals who work in this environment and work on child crimes cases will tell you these are cases involving children one street over. This isn't somebody who's in a different town, in a different country, on a different continent. This is somebody who's down the road and might be from a situation that's a little worse off. Because it's also not just happening in big cities. It's happening in small local cities and rural villages. And again, it's not just children being sexualized, local children being sexualized or smuggled. And it's not just foreign children being smuggled. There is individuals in the public, laypersons have a pretty stereotypical idea of what human smuggling looks like. They think it happens particularly involving certain groups of folks, but the sad fact is it's local children. And what individuals who work in this area will tell you, at least this individual, is that they see local children from all walks of life. It's not just who you think would end up being trafficked is the person who ends up being trafficked. It's everybody, and it can happen to anybody. And again, one thing that gets lost in the shuffle when you're talking about trafficking is that when you have a child who's being trafficked these days, it's almost always not just a trafficking crime. You're going to have an attendant solicitation, an attendant enticement, or an attendant online exploitation, given the use of the internet to recruit. And what that really means, and the sad fact is that this exploitation isn't something that just happens once and then goes away. Like all online crimes, these images, these videos, the evidence is there forever, because once it's introduced into the wild ecosystem, there's almost no way that somebody can go ahead and close up Pandora's box, because an image once distributed cannot be taken back down. So before we get transitioned over to Charlotte, I just want to go ahead and say, I'll point to a little bit saying, some of you might be still wondering, even though we've talked about the local nature of this, well, is it a problem in Alaska? Well, as I'm sure y'all are aware, for any number of reasons, this is one of the particular problems with trafficking, is the fact that it's a largely underreported crime, particularly in areas rural areas where individuals might not have the same intersection with services that they might have in larger cities. As you all are aware, Alaska has a lot of rural territory and a lot of folks living off the beaten path. Yet nonetheless, we're still here on the map. We still have, in 2017, the Polaris Project identified instances of trafficking in Alaska, in Anchorage, in Juneau. So it sounds like a national issue, and it sounds like it's happening just in Houston or just in New York, but no, it's happening here, and we want to address the issue. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. That was just really helpful. So that's a really good transition too. You can see from the map that Chris just showed that we know this is a problem in Alaska. So now that we know what trafficking is, and I just want to emphasize the real nuts and bolts definition is it's exploitation. It's compelling or coercing somebody to work or engage in a commercial sex act. The two are not mutually exclusive. You can be doing, one can be the other thing. But I think that if we think about the exploitation of vulnerability is sort of the essence of what everything comes down to when you talk about trafficking. So I'm going to talk about some common myths with trafficking. Chris, you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So frankly, I think the word itself is a bit of a misnomer and probably has not helped in its progression as something that we are dealing with, but trafficking is not the same as smuggling. Trafficking does not require transportation, okay? Smuggling is a crime against borders. Trafficking is a crime against people. So that's a helpful way to think about trafficking. It does not require transportation of somebody from one place to another. It's not just kids. There is a lot of focus on kids and minor victims of trafficking, and it's a hugely important component of trafficking, but it happens to kids and adults. It happens to immigrants and US citizens. It really crosses all these boundaries. And we're sort of, as a country, I think, trying to move away from talking about it as something that, might render images of a Connex and somebody chained to, a bed in a Connex. That's really not, it's not what it's looking like the most of the time now. So it's all about the money. When you think about trafficking and what all the prosecutions have shown is that it is a $150 billion industry globally. So when you think about that, that is bigger than Microsoft. It's bigger than Samsung, Exxon, and BP gross profits per year combined. So it's a huge industry. And a fair amount of that, it does take place overseas, but a lot of it takes place in the US. Chris, you can click through that. So this is a statistic I heard recently that sort of, I thought it was incredibly intriguing. 70% of traffickers exploit their victims in their own country. So if you're a victim of trafficking, you're likely to be a victim of trafficking where you live. It doesn't require you to, it's not as common to be a victim of trafficking in another country. Yes, there are many cases of movement, but it really affects us where we live. And that's why it's so important as a state to really heighten its priority. Let's see. You can click through that, Chris. So the idea that trafficking is sex trafficking. Trafficking is sex trafficking, but trafficking is also labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is a really big component of it. I think when we, for most of us, both lay people and within the trafficking world, sex trafficking is something that we understand a lot more. We have been familiar with it for longer. And kind of when trafficking first was sort of legally named under the 2000 legislation called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we really thought of it primarily as sex, and the reality is it's labor too. And I think the labor piece it's very complex because it involves not just criminal law, but it involves civil law, it involves administrative law, and it involves behaviors that we haven't necessarily as a society identified as criminal. So seeing a cleaning crew coming in to clean a big box store after they close at night. There was a recent federal case in the Mid-Atlantic region, and there was a huge trafficking scheme going on with those workers. But when you drive by that store and you see a cleaning crew coming in, that doesn't scream crime. That's something that we might see every day. So it really does, it crosses all boundaries. You can keep going, Chris, sorry. So we talked about the sex, we talked about the kids, we talked about the money. I want to talk a little bit about a sort of complex idea, and I just want to kind of put it on your radar so you can think about it while we finish up and while Ingrid goes. When we talk about a scenario where there is a coercive scheme, so somebody's trafficking people, and I'm going to give an example of somebody trafficking 4 victims out of a house, selling them for sex. So when you think about it, let's say there's a 14 and a 16-year-old. So legally, those would be immediately considered victims, right? Because they're minors under the law. And say there's also a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old who are victims as well, but under the law, they could be labeled criminals as well. And so there's a lot of complexity about like how we think and how the law treats people of different ages. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the victimization starts when somebody's a minor, and it carries through to adulthood. So that's why I think it's important to kind of just conceptualize trafficking as something that does involve minors and adults. And you can click through that, Chris. And this is kind of the last myth I'll talk about, and for me, kind of the scariest is that if you look at this pie chart, this is not a crime that is committed by strangers. This is a crime that is committed by people who victims often know. So family friend, 14%, stranger, 9%, boyfriend, 27%, employer, so that would be clear-cut case of labor trafficking, 14%, and then immediate family, 36% of trafficking happens within an immediate family relationship. And so I think, you know, this is a sort of something that is really, it presents a lot of challenges for prosecutors because it's sort of like a invisible wall. This crime is not only hidden by nature, but it's often hidden within a family. And so just all the more reason why it's so important to have community members educated about it so that they might be able to identify some signs, or if they see something, they kind of take note and check in. And you can go to the next slide, Chris. So ANTHC, I know that you guys, I mean, there's a plethora of services and ways that ANTHC interacts with our community and our state and members of our state. And I think this is a really important statistic about the potential role of organizations like ANTHC. So 67% of individuals who either have or are currently being trafficked come into contact with medical providers, be it behavioral health, be it urgent cares, ERs, there's some contact. And I think when we think about trafficking, we want to think about, a lot of times there's not, it doesn't usually, it's not something we necessarily identify at a single point of contact, but that's where we start. And I think as we become more educated as a state and as a community, we can kind of flag these indicators at various stages, if that makes sense to folks. So you can click through the next that, Chris, thanks. I want to talk about a couple things that you, in a healthcare context, but also really this applies to people just in our communities, in our state, what should be on the lookout for. So there's physical indicators of trafficking. So in a medical setting, you might think about like somebody whose care is delayed, they put off going to the doctor. These are not necessarily folks that have regular access to preventative services or sort of health maintenance services. There's also, a lot of times they're not necessarily living the healthiest life. They may not have readily available nutritious food. So malnourishment is one. Sexually transmitted infections are a huge one. OBGYNs and women's care and reproductive care has a role to play in this. We know that there's a high incidence of abortions among trafficking victims. And there's also just a high incidence of, a lack of sort of regular interaction with OBGYNs. So I think they have a really unique role. Somebody who's a victim might not, they might not have the best hygiene. They might have suspicious tattoos or branding. That's a big one. They might, and this is probably the one I want to emphasize the most, and I'm not sure why it's last, but substance abuse and a history of sexual assault or a history of physical assault or a neglect. I think what I want to drive home is that when we talk about trafficking victims, we are talking about people who are vulnerable and there's so many different ways that somebody can be vulnerable. But we know that there is a very strong correlation between prior sexual assault, prior sexual violence, and also like parental substance abuse is highly correlated with minor victims of trafficking. So the last one there, Chris, is no eye contact. When we talk about somebody who's vulnerable, we're talking about somebody who's probably not super confident, not secure and outgoing, but whether the person is there with them or whether they're sort of communicating with them on a phone or some other way, these people are sort of under the control of another person. And that is the coercive scheme. And so I think if you think about somebody who defers to other people for answers or doesn't provide a full medical history, those are the kinds of indicators in a healthcare setting that we might look at. So you can click through that, Chris. So this is a really going forward. I mean, thinking about it's such a complex crime. Their victimology is very complex. It involves law enforcement and involves victim services. So there's these two huge arenas, but I think together we need to recognize that there are some universal sort of standards about how we know these victims might present or interact with society. So generally, and almost every time, a person who is a victim of trafficking is not going to answer yes if you ask them if they're a victim of trafficking. Because the psychological coercion in a trafficking scheme is such that they might be resistant to help. They likely don't know they're a victim or aren't ready to face that reality. So they won't identify themselves as a victim. You can keep clicking. You can just click through the whole thing, Chris. So leaving a medical facility against medical advice would be a really, really common thing that we see with victims. What we talked about before with kind of scripted questions or confusing answers. I mean, some depending on the situation, and these victims look a lot different in different settings and different types of coercive schemes. And you know, one of these indicators doesn't necessarily make a mean that somebody is definitely a victim, but it's a flag. It's something to look out for. And so fearful, nervous, symptoms of anxiety or PTSD. And again, I just want to hammer this home. When there's a reluctance to answer questions themselves, or to kind of defer to another person that may be with them, or maybe communicating with them on a phone or else, or some other mechanism, that's a really big flag that we want to make sure that we know. And so you can go to the next slide, Chris. So nearly every trafficking victim does have their communications monitored, either electronically or physically, or they're in a location where they don't have the freedom to interact with the society, like outside, without somebody basically watching them. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you think you suspect a trafficking situation. So there might be reluctancy to, for example, take some kind of like a pamphlet with information about resources, because that might be the very thing that gets them in trouble. So we need to be really creative in how we address this. And I think a lot of it comes down to trying, I know in the limited time you might have in a healthcare setting, but trying to create some kind of a trusting relationship or rapport with the victim in a non-judgmental way is so important. When we talk, especially about labor trafficking, a lot of people don't have access to their personal documents or identification. We are actually seeing this a lot in the Valley right now, with a large percentage of youth who have presented without identification. So that's something that that's a pretty big flag. If somebody doesn't have a driver's license, if they don't know their address, if they don't know their phone number, that's kind of notable. And then the fragmented or limited medical history, that sort of goes without saying, because they probably have not been interacting regularly with a doctor or provider. And so why does all this matter? Because again, just to bring this home, you all are who they interact with. We are who they interact with, each of us. And so not to bring it back to an airport slogan, but it's like a situation where if we see something, we should say something, we should take note, we should be aware and make sure that we can kind of check in, and it doesn't have to be done in a way that's confrontational or direct or anything like that. So Chris, you can click through that. So these are some of the barriers that other folks that I've worked with have identified, and just kind of like a brainstorming session. But with providers, I think there's a sense that you only interact with these folks for a couple minutes at most sometimes. And so how do you broach this subject if you think that there might be something wrong? How do you ask? If you do ask and you do feel that it warrants some kind of a referral, who do you call? And so we really hope to explore all those types of questions with you guys in the future. I think that the important thing is to basically have like a protocol or procedure and process that works for everybody, depending on the situation and depending on the organization. We have law enforcement that are working in this full time, that are like more or less on call. And Ingrid's going to show you some slides of contact information, but there's definitely, we really encourage, you know, being on the lookout for this in the community. So yeah, can you go one forward? Thanks. So just a couple of general considerations, and then I'll sort of finish up. While trafficking victims usually present as victims of domestic violence or victims of sexual assault, or even they might present as somebody who has a petty theft conviction or whatnot, there's a much more complicated psychological coercion history going on there. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Don't expect to be the expert on it. There are experts that you can kind of call in and rely on. It's touchy. And so I think just knowing when to pick up the phone is a really important thing. Disclosure. I mean, when we talk about disclosure, that's something that, at least in law enforcement, that happens over time. It's not something that you probably will see and then report, although it could be the case. Not going to rule anything out at this point. I think having procedures in place for referrals is really important. We've been working with the Department of Labor on developing procedures. We work with the FBI and the troopers, and there's sort of a core group of people who are working on this and are definitely like available for referrals. And so Chris and I are going to put up that contact information at the end, and Ingrid will provide some additional contact. And I think keep in mind, a lot of times when you call one number, you might get the other one. A lot of, you know, there's a lot of talking that goes on amongst these folks. So yeah, and so Chris, you can keep going through. I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, you can keep clicking through. So asking things like, rather than asking questions like, and we talked about this, are you a victim of trafficking? Think about things that are more relaxed. How can I help you? How did you get here? What do you need? What can I do for you? Can I, you know, do you need a gift card for a meal or something like that? Just to kind of start that conversation. That's always a helpful way to start. And here are some resources for healthcare, and I'm happy to offline have conversations about that. I want to finish up here and give Ingrid some time. So Chris, I think we'll probably skip the video. So really quickly, I'll touch on this, but I mean, it's sort of, we at the Department of Law, the Attorney General's office, we work really closely with different law enforcement agencies, local, APD, federal. Ingrid will be presenting. I work a lot on the MMIP stuff with Ingrid and a bunch of other people. We are in the process and have had meetings with corrections and DHSS and DJJ and among others. I know I'm leaving them a bunch out, labor and education, to kind of talk about how different agencies can address this in a way that might like make the biggest impact and sort of create a solution that would allow all of us to kind of talk to each other about how we're addressing this. We also work really closely with victim service providers, Covenant House, Priceless, Alaska Institute for Justice, and we really do want to work with you guys, and we're very open to collaboration and are really welcoming it. So please do feel free to reach out with any questions. And then the next slide, Chris, can you go to the contact info? So what do you do if you see somebody or you think that somebody might be being trafficked? The Alaska Criminal Intelligence Center, there's the number, there's also an email there. You may well get a voicemail, leave a message if you're comfortable. I think Ingrid will probably reiterate this, but Sergeant or Special Agent Jolene Godin. There's her phone number and her email. Lenny Torres of APD and the FBI. And then the state troopers, Paul Wegson is our go-to, and there's his email right there. And any questions about any of that, feel free to email me and I will refer you on to any of them. Thank you so much for that. Sorry if we went over a little bit.
Thank you so much, Chris and Charlotte. You've definitely given us a lot to think about. I am receiving some really great questions, and I'll save those for later after Ingrid has had a chance to present. And just to kind of put this next presentation into context, we are talking about human trafficking in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, which segues into, I guess, just joining in welcoming Alaska Department of Justice Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Coordinator, Ingrid Cumberlidge.
Thank you. I find it a mouthful too. Thank you, Chris and Charlotte. I really appreciate that information. I'm going to echo some of it, but I'm going to move pretty quickly. Ong, hello and welcome. I am just so pleased to be here. I want to say thank you to Kathleen and Suva and Debbie for helping to put this together, and ANTHC for having us, and also to the people of the land. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate and reach out into Alaska and talk about everything. I'm going to take a moment and see if I can share my screen. It's always an exercise in technology, but let's see if we can do it here. Kathleen, can you see that? Great. Okay. So my name is Ingrid Cumberlidge. Again, I am Tlingit and Aleut. My Aleut name is Haika, meaning dog salmon. My Tlingit family is dog salmon and raven. My parents are Dick and Edith Jacobson from Sandpoint. My grandparents are Ivy and John Jacobson from Sandpoint and Unga. My maternal grandparents are Carmel and Alfred Widmark and Demert from Klawock and Juneau. And I have family all over the state of Alaska, and I am your Missing and Murdered Indigenous Person Coordinator. I'm a contractor with the Department of Justice in the United States Attorney's Office here in Anchorage for the District of Alaska. My slide's not going to move. Let's see if I can do it manually. There we go. So as I talk today, we're going to review some of the things that Chris and Charlotte talked about, but we're also going to help you become familiar with human trafficking and its relationship with missing and murdered Indigenous persons in Alaska. We're also going to help you become aware of some of the prevention and intervention efforts and identify where to go for help in response to human trafficking. We got some of that on Charlotte's slide. We'll review some of those things. And I want to start with Senator Lisa Murkowski's comments to the Senate Indian Affairs Committee in November of 1919. She really brings it home for Alaska. She says, "The missing and murdered Indigenous women's stories will break your heart. Many vulnerable Native women may leave their villages and get swept up into a net that is devastating. And I, as the coordinator, just in my short experience here, would tell you that it's not just women, it's girls, boys, men who are caught up in this net too often." Murkowski says that within 24 hours, they are trafficked, they're murdered. The loss is unspeakable. So what is human trafficking? For Alaska Native women, men, girls, and boys are victims of trafficking. And just to review those components that you need to be trafficked, there has to be force, fraud, coercion. There has to be some requirement to provide labor and commercial sex. But for minors, there only has to be commercial sex. And anybody under 18 in Alaska is considered a minor. But remember, this could be your brother. This could be your sister. It could be your mother. This could be anybody that you're familiar with. This human trafficking is not selective. And again, there's always some perceptions that we have out there. Certainly, I didn't know a lot about human trafficking as I came into this position. And I really didn't expect it to be much of the communication. But as we went out to tribes, it really was. The perceptions out there were that it always involves kidnapping or physical force. The reality is that's not true. It often involves psychology, defrauding, manipulating, threatening self and others, convincing that there are other factors like romance and other things. Another myth is that sex trafficking only includes women and girls. But the reality is that as many as half of the sex trafficking victims are male. Human trafficking requires transporting victims, and Charlotte mentioned this, of course it does not, but in Alaska, it can also include being done in your home and in your villages and in your cities. And it is, as Charlotte mentioned, underreported. Trafficked people are physically unable to leave their trafficker. This one surprised me. The reality is that they often lack the necessities, a place to live, transportation, the ability to buy food. They're afraid for themselves, or they're afraid for others, family members, or they're afraid just of the shame of something being shared that they wouldn't want their family to know. Traffickers target victims they don't know, and Charlotte mentioned this as well. That's not true. They're often trafficked by people that they do know, sometimes romantic partners, spouses, or family. This one addresses minors specifically, and it comes from the missingkids.org. It's a good resource for you to check out for content. But who are those trafficking predators? Persons who profit from the selling of a child for sex abuse, perceived trusted adults, romantic partners, family members, foster parents, friends and peers, and gangs. And I'm being told from my office that this is kind of roughly the order of the people that are doing this. Another character might be a buyer who's directly exploiting a child's vulnerabilities, may exploit the child for a child's needs in exchange for sex, things like food, not limited to, but food and shelter. And once they've introduced drugs, the need for drugs once they've addicted a child. Now, we have a number of things going on. We interact with these kids in a lot of cases. I'm a former educator of 23 years, and you know those kids that are at risk. You see them in the clinics, you see them in the schools, you see them interacting with law enforcement. These are at-risk kids. They're children who have experienced physical, sex abuse, or other adverse childhood experiences, those ACEs, that are more likely to be trafficked. When we're interacting with them in a number of ways, but we also can help prevent them from being trafficked by getting involved with them at all these levels. And not just initially when those incidences are happening, when they become at risk, but throughout their lives. If we can stay involved with them and interact with them, we can make a real difference in Alaska. As medical staff, as family members, as police and child services and victim services, we need to make sure that our services don't discriminate on the basis of race, age, sex, that we allow our kids to be heard, that we give them some voice in the decision making, and we respect and provide dignity for them as they go. Remember, if they're at risk and they've had any adverse childhood experiences, the chances are that we're going to see them again. They may become victims of human trafficking. As you think about the prevention, our tribal pilots in their tribal community response plan for missing and murdered Indigenous people identified a number of things that they wanted to do and they really believed could help. And they all brought up trafficking on their own. It wasn't something that I brought to them. They all identified it to me as they started doing work in their pilot project sites. They identified that they really needed to provide strong cultural connections, fish camp, culture camp. They wanted to have men's houses where they could have men's activities for boys and men. They wanted to have women's houses where they could have women's activities for women and girls. They wanted to build strong family and school and church and community ties. And as you think about this, I really want you to think about your own kids, your own relationships with your brothers and sisters. Have you built networks for them? Are there people that they can go to where they can tell them anything? You know, I have two young boys in their teens, and I'd like to think that they do have people in their life that they could tell anything, even if they were ashamed of the activity, that they could tell somebody. But I can count maybe two. So this is something that we can really actively do. We can build this in our youth and tell them that they're going to be safe no matter what they have to say. Those networks where I can tell you anything. Building the you are valuable, important networks. I had a wonderful school that I grew up in, and I remember a young woman that was involved with domestic violence actively, and the teachers surrounded her and protected her throughout our school career and really built her up and convinced her that she was valuable and important. But as soon as school ended, as soon as she graduated, she lost that connection. She just didn't have that anymore. We need those connections to continue. And remember to really address those kids that are at risk. We need education and outreach on stranger danger. And remember that stranger danger is in your community. It's not just in your, when you're traveling, you need to be aware of it when you're traveling. And the other big factor is social media. Charlotte and Chris mentioned this one. And I have to tell you, this is really when we let our kids go out on the computer, and I'm guilty of it too. When we let them go out on the computer, it's really like tossing them out of the plane without the parachute, or without teaching them how to open the parachute. If you look at this image down here at the bottom, you're really sending them out into the world. I've had my son say, "Hey, I'm playing with somebody from Australia." You know, you don't know. You don't know who that person is on the hands that's playing on the computer. And you really need to give them the tools to make sure when you throw them out of the plane that they have a whole network of people supporting them. And they have some safety rules. They know some things about stranger danger. When they're coming into Anchorage, when they're coming into Fairbanks, when they're coming into Juneau, they have some ideas about stranger danger. When they know somebody tells them, "Hey, I've got a great modeling career for you, come on down." Some things are just a little too good to be true. And they ask questions. And again, they go back to those persons that they can tell anything to and ask questions and find out more information. Now, keeping our tribal children and members safe, some of the primary things that we need to do is really learn how to talk to our children and family about sex trafficking and human trafficking. And I know those are uncomfortable conversations, but our kids need to know that there is trafficking in the state of Alaska. We've talked about some of the different ways that happens, both in the previous presentation and some of the myths and things here, but romance, false promises, flattery, telling your kids are always looking for support and the belief that they're important. And if they're not getting it in their community environment, they're getting it online. They're finding some place to get it. Drugs, being introduced to drugs, maintaining addiction is another way. Gifts, being given gifts that they're told are gifts, and then coming back a week or two later and saying, "Oh no, you have to pay for that." So requiring payback, putting them in a debt situation, isolating them from their friends and peers and family, and normalizing sex. And again, you can go to missingkids.org. It's a good resource to look at this. Recruiters are in Alaska are using peers to recruit minors more and more, and peers may be trafficked by peers. The other places that recruiters might go, this is not your old guy, outside the playground sort of stereotype that we're talking about. They might loiter where Native youth are coming together in places. Juvenile detention centers, again, are at-risk youth, people that are involved with the law, people that are displaced, or homeless shelters. Community and activity centers, bars, continuing education institutions. One of my first trainings with human trafficking when I came into this position, a young woman had gone to school in Oregon and met somebody that she thought needed help. And she helped and helped, and then he followed her back, and then he took her out of state and trafficked her. This is something that happens. Commercial fishing centers, tourism centers, other economic centers. But the primary places for young youth, again, those juvenile detention centers, those homeless centers. This was mentioned in an earlier slide, so I won't spend much time on this. I'm just telling you, if you're involved in the medical centers, you are probably seeing these people present, okay? They're presenting in our clinics, they're presenting in our hospitals, they're presenting for various things that Charlotte reviewed with you, so I'm gonna skip on over that. And I'm gonna tell you, I really didn't believe this was gonna be very much of an issue. I went through my first couple trainings, I was aware of the terminology, I wasn't really aware of the background when I first came into my job. And what I have to say is we've talked about it in the statewide working group. We've had training on it from the FBI. And this statewide working group, this Alaska Missing and Murdered Indigenous Person group, is a multidisciplinary group that's really focused on our tribes in Alaska. And it's made up of stakeholders that are interacting with us in a number of different ways. Excuse me. There are 4 tribal representatives across the state. There are 3 pilot site tribal representatives. There are federal, state, municipal, and tribal law enforcement, search and rescue, as well as our victim services representatives. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like across the state, the yellow, the gold here, and the royal blue gives you an indication of where they are. And they're VPSO supervisors, they're state troopers, they're FBI, the United States attorneys, U.S. Marshals, U.S. Coast Guard, the BIA cold case officer, there's tribal representatives, and again, those victim service representatives on this group. And we've talked about human trafficking as an issue in the state of Alaska. But where we really talked about it was in our tribal pilot program, as we went out and did tribal community response plans to help tribes prepare in how to deal with some of these issues and how to respond early. We had 3 tremendous tribes: Chowan Tribal Council from Dillingham, the tribal village of Unacleet, the Koyukuk Native Village. And what we asked them to do is to really help us develop a model for other tribes to work and develop their own tribal community response plans. And those included the communities with no law enforcement, the communities with limited law enforcement, VPSOs, TPOs, and those hub communities with communities and or state law enforcement. And every one of these sites said human trafficking is an issue. We're really concerned. We had this many people that went to the city and were lost. We didn't hear back from them. We wanted numbers where we could reach out to law enforcement in those communities and find out about what was happening on those cases. We have fishing interests that have come into the community, and we're concerned about people involved with trafficking in our communities. There were a number of issues. So this is not a lower 48 issue. This is an Alaska issue. Our tribes again were Koyukuk, Unacleet, and Curry. Koyukuk being the interior one, Unacleet up in Norton Sound here, and Dillingham and Bristol Bay there. So as you think about what you can do in your various fields, and I recognize as I start looking down the list, we have folks from all over the spectrum and different various providers. So I just want to share this. This applies to any group, but I did think about ANTHC when we put it together. When you're screening, okay, I'm going to give you some tools to think about as you screen. And then we need to also take this opportunity to educate, to really be telling kids and helping parents to have these discussions. One of the places that you can go to do that and build up your capacity is the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center. They'll help you in connection to resources. They'll help you with projects to build response. They'll help you in working with partners. And they're just a really good resource for doing that. But the other places within the state of Alaska are Alaska State Troopers. When you have a concern, reach out to them. You know, our clinics and hospitals, we're working to get them the capacity and the connection to resources to support you. Our child advocacy centers, our domestic violence and sexual assault centers, They already have those resources. Reach out to them. They'll give you more information. Priceless Alaska is a faith-based organization that's helping people get out of human trafficking, and they're also doing some of that training for some of the clinical staff. The FBI, Charlotte mentioned the FBI connection on her slides, and I believe that you got the slides, so I would look back to those direct connections. And then you can always reach out to me and I'll help you connect out to any of those partners. But as you intervene, again, I'm just going to repeat quickly because Charlotte already covered this a little bit. You know, you really want to make sure that those individuals that you're interacting with, that you're concerned about, that you provide some level of safety and respect for them. You know, don't ask them about the human trafficking. Build a rapport with them. Find out what's going on with them. Be friendly, okay? And make sure you're just respecting their rights as patients as you go. And here are some very specific things that came from Jordan Greenbaum and the Institute of Healthcare and Human Trafficking. There's some questions that you can add to your question bank that you're already asked as any patients, and they'll go pretty quickly. Do you have a job or some activity in exchange for money or something else of value like shelter, food, or clothing? Consider some of these questions as you talk about that job. Is someone else in charge of your money that you earn? It's just a yes or no. It'll be fast. Do you owe money to your boss or anyone else? Has anyone lied to you about the kind of work or activity that you'll be doing? Is this job activity, does anyone pressure you to do something that makes you feel bad? Have you been hurt or threatened for doing something wrong or trying to leave your job or situation? As you go on, I think we could expand this section quite a bit, but I recognize your time and we can do this in any field. Learning about their connection to their native culture and their sense of identity. Identity questions that it may indicate the loss of culture or identity and historical trauma. Do you feel connected with your Alaska Native culture in terms of language, cultural activity? We could put grandparents, family. There are a number of things you could add to this, but it'll help give you an idea. And this was also mentioned last presentation. Remember, you have, when you're intervening, you may have somebody that wants to come into the appointment with them. You may, and for various reasons, they'll convince you that's a really good idea. They may give false information, a connection to the patient. They may restrict the patient from talking. They may talk for the patient. They definitely will be a companion of some domineering or controlling attitude. And you may find that the patient that you're concerned about might be intimidated, submissive. They might not know where they are staying or basic information about the city. They might also give some false information. I'm not going to review the physical health effects because I thought Charlotte did a really nice job and Chris reviewed those. But do remember as you're talking about this that there are health effects to look for, and there may be physical signs of physical abuse. Remember, talk about those healthy relationships, what they should expect in a healthy relationship. What are the impacts of violence on health? You've had some of this training in domestic violence sections. Think about that. Harm reduction techniques and human trafficking. Make sure they understand the language of human trafficking, what human trafficking is. And here is just a really good resource to help you. And again, this came from the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center. But it's got some great links that will really help you out. You can go out and look for these, or you can come back to me and ask for the links to these. But we have the HEAL Trafficking Center, which is the Health Education Advocacy Linkage. And they have some great resources from a public health issue point of view. They have the HEAL Trafficking and Hope for Justice Protocol Kit, which will help you a little bit. We also have the PATH group, which is Physicians Against the Trafficking of Humans, and one that I've used a lot, which is the SOAR online training. I really liked the way they presented the material. I thought it was useful even in the state of Alaska. And it's provided by the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. And they've also got some training and technical assistance separate from that as well. You heard Chris mention the Polaris project. We have the human trafficking and healthcare industry there, and some recommendations from there as well. So lots of good resources for you to go and increase your education about some of these issues. And then finally, where do we go? What are some of the places that you can go? And these are just general places. Charlotte gave you some very specific numbers. And so I want you to reflect on those. I'm hoping that we can put that slide back up as we go into questions, and you can have those numbers again. But generally in your communities, we want to be calling Alaska State Troopers and your municipal or tribal law enforcement as soon as possible. And particularly for missing or murder. Somebody goes missing. We've had this question come up in work group often. We, as Alaska Native people, are often trying to solve the problem immediately ourselves. We often go out and search and put some time into it. And what happens is when somebody goes missing and we do that, we lose those precious minutes and hours and time at the front end, and we need to call immediately. So as soon as somebody is suspected of being missing, you can always call back and say, hey, they've been found. That's fine. But at the front end, you need to be calling. We need to increase the expediency of when we are calling when somebody goes missing, so that our state troopers and our municipal and tribal law enforcement people can respond as soon as possible. And that's 911 or your local dispatch numbers. We can go to our Alaska Tribal Clinics and our Alaska Native Medical Center. Again, those child advocacy centers and domestic violence and sexual assault centers, Priceless Alaska and other service-based organizations, Victims for Justice, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and as Charlotte mentioned, the FBI, and all of those specific numbers that she shared with you that we'll try and put back up again. Nationally, there are some other places that you can go, both for information and to make reports. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a cyber tip line that you can go to at report.cybertip.org. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, again, has a number, and that www.state.gov/human trafficking is a good place for that, as well as 888-373-7888. A good place to connect with a service provider in your area, and another resource for you just on the national level. And I want to say thank you. I kind of rushed through because I was feeling the pressure of time. So I have to tell you, I'm a teacher of 23 years. I love questions. So I'm hoping that you will come back and ask questions of Chris and Charlotte and I, so we can participate with that with you. But thank you to the Alaska Native Health Tribal Consortium for hosting this important discussion on human trafficking and missing and murdered Indigenous people. Kakasakun, Gunishchish, Koyana, Anabase, Koyanapak, thank you so much. And again, my contact information I put in the chat. So if you look back in the chat, you can find it there as well, 907-271-3314, or the acronym is United States Attorney Alaska, or USAAK.MMIP for missing and murdered Indigenous persons, at usdoj.gov for those people that are on phone. And I also have the information for the missing and murdered unit, which was formerly the cold case unit. If you want that information, we can share that as well. And I want to take us back to who we are. So we have Charlotte Rand and Chris Darnall from the Attorney General's office, and myself, and we really are very happy to answer questions. But I'm going to end my slideshow so that if we wanted to put that last one back up, we can. And I want to say thank you again. And we're happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. I guess I'll get started with some of the questions I received in the chat earlier. This one seems to be more pointed toward Chris and Charlotte. With the huge increase in illegal aliens, including unaccompanied children crossing our southern border this year, should we expect to see an increase in trafficking cases for labor and sex over the next few years?
I can jump in on that if if you want for a sec. You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know that anecdotally or just kind of off the cuff, I don't think that is going to be really relevant for Alaska. What I will tell you is that we already have a large labor trafficking economy. So we have lots of seasonal workers that come in on visas. We have fisheries. I don't know if you guys follow the news, but there's been some pretty big seafood processing trafficking cases. There was recently a class action in the federal courthouse in Washington State. I don't know that they're going to be related to the any activities at the southern border of the U.S. just because I think a lot of our labor trafficking issues are related to our tourist-based economy and kind of our other things about our economy that already exist, if that helps. But there's always a possibility.
And I'll agree with that. I just want to say I'm not seeing cases that involved individuals from the southern border and the things that I've been asked to look at. So from historical's perspective, I don't have anything to point to say, sure, that might be something I'm going to be dealing with in the future. Like Charlotte said, it's a possibility. But again, there's kind of built-in networks where folks are already being trafficked, seasonal workers, individuals who are working in-house for relatives, hotels and hospitality, things like that don't necessarily require an influx of new workers. We already have an economy in place.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. I'm just going to go through the questions as I received them. So the next question, I think again is primarily for Chris and Charlotte. On the legal side of referring people who you suspect might be trafficked intersect with other illegal activities with the suspected victim, like opioid and meth use, even if they're being trafficked. So let's see, so they need to be, so I guess the question is really with individuals who might be engaged in other like illegal activities, but are victims of trafficking, like do they need to be concerned about being incarcerated? There's a lot of concern about potential trafficking issues, and there's a concern about well-intentioned referrals leading to people being incarcerated.
I can jump on that briefly and just give you my perspective as a prosecutor. I'm very aware as someone who's handling these cases that most of my victims are going to come with theft cases. They're going to come with drug charges. There's going to be baggage because that's just the reality of what happens to somebody who's forced to live in the life. I'm not going to charge those victims with those crimes, but I absolutely understand the hesitancy because they don't have a good experience with law enforcement, and what am I but law enforcement a step above. So I get why there'd be some concern. From my perspective as a prosecutor, I think in those cases where you have a victim who comes with baggage and understandable baggage, that's where advocacy comes in and plays a huge role. Somebody who can kind of be a buffer between myself and the victim. So if they do have questions that I'm not maybe going to be the best person to answer, I like to have an advocate between me and the individual out there, because it kind of gives them a little peace of mind, gives them a filter between me and them, and that helps make my case stronger. And if Charlotte or Ingrid has anything, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of add on to that just a little bit. There's a lot I could say about that question. I think that it's a really important thing to talk about. The idea that victims as criminals as victims. There's a lot that we're evolving on as a society in terms of understanding what victimization does to somebody over the period of their life. And so, yes, exactly what Chris said. We know that it's common and expected for victims to have criminal records. I just want to add, we also know that a lot of recruiting goes on in jail. So, I mean, the concern about incarceration, I think that that's just something that's important to keep in mind. It's all part of the same system. And that's why we're working with the Department of Corrections. And I think that kind of as a society, the more that we can understand how victims often kind of get locked into a life, the better we will be able to handle the complexity of these cases. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Ingrid.
The only thing that I would add is we have a tremendous victim service group that's developing in the state of Alaska. There's been a lot of money that has gone into it tribally. There certainly are some victim services organizations that are out there, and I think we can build and develop support for folks that are in jeopardy, that are going through the process, that can help through the process as we go. And I also do think that there's some other organizations that are already pretty well established that can support through that process too. Crisis Alaska comes to mind as one of those organizations. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to acknowledge a comment that we received. I definitely apologize for using some language that was not person-centered or destigmatizing. So I'll do my best to, I guess, translate some of these questions if needed. Another question is, are there direct correlations or specific rates of identified risk for our children in foster care and the likelihood of becoming a victim of trafficking?
I can take that. So we know, so I think the way that we think of, I mean, I think the research talks about this, and I think the most helpful way to think about it is that there's a pool of vulnerability. It's called the vulnerability paradox. Foster care is one of the many things that make somebody very, very vulnerable to trafficking. And then when you think about foster care, you think that probably there's some other vulnerabilities like lack of family structure, potential substance abuse of a caregiver. And so there are high correlations of foster care minors who are trafficked. Covenant House has done studies, not just in Alaska, but across a bunch of different cities where it has shelters. Covenant House Alaska does an incredible job, and they're really on the cutting edge of victim service providers as far as housing. They provide housing, they provide navigation, kind of life skills navigation. They have a 2-year residential program for minor victims of trafficking. And so, yes, there's a correlation. And I think that I'm really proud to report that I think, yes, in Alaska, at least, there are some victim services providers that are sort of aware of and target that correlation in that population that's very vulnerable.
Thank you. Let's see, I know that we had some questions earlier. Okay, so here's a question that Margaret shared in the chat. Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what this is referring to, but the question is, are there any legislators involved? There are a lot of law enforcement, social workers, healthcare personnel, but who is taking policy advocacy to stop census, social media access, maybe censor social media access, keeping criminals and crime syndicates accountable, etc.?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. That's a great question. I think that it's always helpful if you know, for us as Alaskans, as community members, as human beings, to talk to our legislators about issues that are important to us. I'm not going to comment on specific legislators that are taking these issues up, other than I really do encourage people to have input.
I want to acknowledge that it is 2:30. We do have more questions, I believe, but I just want to acknowledge the presenters' times and definitely understand if you need to jump off.
Happy to stick around.
Me too.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to discuss. Okay. And then we have a question for Ingrid. Will there be presentations on the work done with the community response toolkits developed by the 3 pilot projects?
Yeah, right now there's regional association meetings that are happening already. The models are not quite complete, but the work that they've done is complete, and so are nearing completion. And so the pilots are going out to the regions. We've met with ABCP region. We anticipate that we're going to meet with them more. They've mentioned other events that they're going to bring us out for in the future. We've met with Canada Chief Conference, both in their subcommittee chiefs meetings and also in a separate listening and consultation session. We're headed out to Coeric on the 29th for their regional meeting, and we're hoping that some of that is going to be in person as well as on Zoom for the tribes. So that's available and out there. And we're headed out to Bristol Bay Native Association on the 5th of May. That one is going to be a Zoom only, but again, available to the tribes. So that outreach is happening, and that really is the purpose of that, is to talk about what happened with the tribal community response plan, and for all the partners to share what they shared with the communities and the pilot sites. So Charlotte has been an active member on our working group, and she comes and she shares about Department of Law, and it's just been tremendous at coming. And I don't know how she has as much time as she does, but because there are a number of people on my working group that I feel are doing twice as much as what I'm doing, and they still manage to show up, and I'm just so proud of their ability and willingness to commit to this effort. But they come and they share with the tribes about all those resources, some of the resources that you saw today. They share about their work and how to make contact if they need support. And it's just been tremendous. The building of relationships across law enforcement and victim services and across those tribal communities has been amazing. And in addition to that, talking to media about what are expectations for the rights and dignity of people in those discussions has been pretty impressive too. And one of our biggest partners that comes every time, in addition to the federal partners and some of those other state partners, has been the Alaska State Troopers. They have come in force and really been present to hear what tribes want and need. So yes, we are reaching out. And in addition to that, we're reaching out to more tribes to ask them to participate in more of their tribal community response planning. So any tribes that are interested in doing that, we're available to begin that work now.
Thank you. I have some questions of my own that I'd like to ask. I believe I've covered all the questions that I've received in the chat. And again, any of the participants, you're welcome to unmute yourself to share your questions, or if you have like related announcements that you want to share, you're certainly welcome to do that. So I just had a question really for Charlotte, I guess for all 3 of you really. But Charlotte, when you were sharing some of the red flags in terms of recognizing like human trafficking, it kind of made me think about how for Alaska Native people, I think that there is kind of inherently some distrust with many institutions, including healthcare. And I was just wondering if you've considered kind of a list of red flags or signs to look out for that might be specific to Alaska Native people, just knowing the complexity of the history and other factors like that.
Yeah, I can definitely try and answer that. I think that's just a really, really good question. And I think Ingrid may or may not have something to add on that as well. I think that I'm really happy you acknowledge that, because what I will say is that, no, I mean, we haven't, but that kind of information, just like you sharing that, is so valuable as we try to make this something that different kind of spheres and communities and cultures can understand. And so, no, but I think that is definitely something worth doing. And I would absolutely love to work with you or ANTHC or somebody who's willing to on that. I have reached out to some of our federal counterparts who are working on developing, and I think you guys, ANTHC, might yourselves be working on developing kind of like more culturally appropriate messages for Alaska Native communities about trafficking. I have some signage, but it's really tailored to tribes in the lower 48. And it kind of is something that I flagged from the get-go, but I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. There's a lot of conversations that need to be had, and I'll let Ingrid jump in if you want.
So my comments are more from just the trust issue. That's a factor that I've been dealing with since I walked into the job. They said, first of all, they said, come into this job and go out and meet with all the tribes and build relationships and get them to trust law enforcement and law enforcement to trust back and forth and across providers, different providers. And then they said, okay, by the way, it's COVID, you're not going to get to travel anywhere and you don't get to talk to anybody, sort of a deal, except for by phone. But I think we've had some pretty amazing things happen. And I think this can translate to the health system as well. I worked in the health system for about 5 years. And one of them, I'll look at the example of the vaccine. We had an incredible amount of distrust with the vaccine. It was statewide. There was some big concerns, and you were able to get some messaging out. The state system was able to get some messaging out, and really just recognize the importance that we get our people vaccinated. And on the whole, both the efforts to do it, to reach out and do it, but also to get that messaging out, have really made a difference. And I have to tell you, this road on murdered and missing Indigenous people is really a dark and bumpy road, but every step that we take makes a difference in building relationships. And so on those pilot sites, when we sat down and talked to those tribes and interacted with them, the response back to law enforcement, where there was no trust, they were very concerned in a lot of cases about the relationship. They were very concerned about the response in some cases. They came away and every single site, they said, thank you, Department of Law, for coming. Thank you to our FBI and our U.S. Marshals and our Alaska State Troopers. And we're so glad to be able to have had this conversation with you. But more than that, they called me afterwards and got numbers, and they talked directly about very specific things. And I think that's true in the healthcare system too. I just truly believe that we have to continue these conversations and really get out and work with our people in our tribes and have these conversations and build that messaging. And I know Debbie and I have talked about this messaging for months now, about some of that messaging that needs to develop. And I also know from a national point of view and Operation Lady Justice that we've been working on some of those discussions as well. So I think it's a long road. I think we have to rebuild from a place. But the other example that I would use is dental. When I grew up, the person that came out and did dental, I remember my cousin sitting in the chair next to me and getting really excited, and somebody literally physically laying a hand on her to calm her down. And the difference that we have now in what happens with our dental folks that go out is they come out and they ask how you are, and they tell you what they're doing. We're gonna go in and we're gonna do this, and it might prick just a little bit, and it just, they talk you through the process. And if you get upset, they say, do you need a minute? And it's just a change in the way and attitude that we treat people. And I'm telling you, it has made a difference from a family member who had complete dentures at 18 to my kids who have the same teeth, who I anticipate are going to have them well into their 80s and 90s, just because the level of care and the way that happens. And as we have these discussions, these hard discussions with human trafficking and looking for signs of domestic violence and other indicators that might lead towards missing and murdered, I think we just have to take those steps and start building those relationships. But it's a process.
Yeah, can I just add to that really quick? I just want to say, just kind of along that line, everything Ingrid said, and just the opportunity to come today to talk about this stuff is where it's huge. It's where we have to start. And I think it's, it leads to stuff down the road, and just developing relationships and interacting with tribes and humans, basically, about like what we need, what do we need to do, what can we do to be better, where are the gaps, let's trust one another as like human beings, and talk on that level. And I think the MMIP stuff has been kind of, well, it's been a lot, but it's been in one way, I think of it as sort of this vehicle that provides a forum to have those conversations that are so important, especially for the Department of Law. And I think it's been really powerful. And I think there's probably some future conversations that to be had, in follow-up about, okay, let's get together and figure out what's going on with trafficking in ANTHC. Where are some of the opportunities that we might try to test out, a referral process or a victim screening card or information card or what have you.
Definitely. I kind of want to put Debbie on the spot. Did you want to respond to any of those comments, Debbie?
Yeah, so I really, this was such an excellent presentation. Oh my gosh, I've been learning right along with everybody else, and so much valuable work. And I just want to encourage people, and from what I've been hearing about the collaboration and the building the relationships, I think that is so crucial. And also, we are working on the messaging for developing safety messages around human trafficking, and really looking at how we could develop those. And I'm still looking for more surveys to help us in that process. But what I've been hearing is that, there's really that, it's really those relationships that will make a big difference. And so I'm excited about the toolkits as well. And, that's going to be a huge push in this movement to develop those procedures and policies. So I'm just excited about the work, and I appreciate you all presenting today. And I know we've, taken a lot of your time. And so just going over that, thank you so much. And to all of the people who were able to participate and attend today.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely very impactful. I know this is a very heavy topic. We're talking about some very, very serious issues. But I know for me personally, it's really good to hear, all the hard work that is going into this from so many different angles, and that I think everyone involved is committed to this collaboration in order to address this larger issue. So I appreciate you all for that.
Well, with that, thank you so much. And we look forward to, I'm sure that you'll be out there, bringing this education and awareness to the community. And I'm sure we'll be attending more of your presentations. Thank you very much for all of your hard work, like Kathleen said. Thank you
so
all.
much for having us.
Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks for having us, everyone.
Yeah.